The night was dark, a smothering blackness that stretched across the twisting country road. Aaron tightened his grip on the steering wheel, his knuckles white, as the headlights of his battered Jeep barely pierced the dense fog surrounding them. Beside him, Clara sat hunched in the passenger seat, her face illuminated by the pale glow of her phone screen. In the back seat, Mark, Clara's younger brother, shifted restlessly, trying to stretch his legs in the cramped space. "We should have stopped hours ago," Clara muttered, her voice taut with frustration. "This map app is completely useless out here." Aaron glanced at her, irritation flickering across his face. "We didn't exactly plan to take a detour into the middle of nowhere, Clara. Maybe if someone had filled up the tank." "Don't start," she snapped, her voice rising above the hum of the engine. Mark groaned from the back. "You guys seriously? We're lost in the middle of nowhere, and you're bickering? How about we just focus on not dying out here?" Aaron sighed, his irritation dissolving into exhaustion. They had been on their way to a remote cabin for a weekend getaway, but a misturn and a steadily emptying gas tank had led them deep into a labyrinth of unfamiliar backroads. Now they were hopelessly lost. Just as the tension in the car threatened to boil over, Clara squinted through the fog. "Wait! What's that?" In the distance, a faint glow shimmered through the haze. As they drove closer, the light resolved into the shape of a lantern, swinging gently from a wooden post. Beneath it, a weathered sign bore the words, "Welcome to Ravenswood Village." "Finally, civilization," Mark exclaimed, pressing his face to the window. "Civilization might be a stretch," Aaron muttered, his eyes scanning the eerie stillness of the village that loomed ahead. The cobblestone street was lined with squat, old-fashioned buildings. Dim, flickering lanterns cast long, wavering shadows on the fog-shrouded ground. The air seemed unnaturally still, as if the world itself had paused to watch them. Aaron parked the Jeep at the edge of the square, its engine sputtering into silence. As they stepped out, the cold bit at their skin, and the silence pressed in like a living thing. The houses were dark, their windows like unblinking eyes staring at the newcomers. A weathered clock tower rose at the center of the village, its hands frozen at midnight. "Creepy," Mark muttered, shoving his hands into his jacket pockets. "Where is everyone?" "They're probably asleep," Clara reasoned, though her voice wavered. She wrapped her scarf tighter around her neck and gestured to one of the buildings. A small wooden sign hung above its door, "The Ravens Rest Inn." "Let's check it out," Aaron suggested, leading the way. Inside, the inn was dimly lit by a single oil lamp on the counter. The air smelled of damp wood and something faintly metallic. A bell sat on the counter, its brass surface tarnished with age. Aaron rang it twice, the sharp sound cutting through the silence like a knife. After a long moment, a figure emerged from the shadows. An elderly woman shuffled forward, her movements slow and deliberate. Her eyes were pale and watery, her smile thin and unsettling. "Travelers," she said, her voice rasping. "It's been a long time since we've had visitors." "We're lost," Clara began, forcing a polite smile, "and our car is out of gas. Do you have a phone or—" "No phones here," the woman interrupted. "No gas either. But you're welcome to stay the night." Her gaze swept over them, lingering a beat too long on each of their faces. "It's not safe to wander after dark." Aaron exchanged a wary glance with Clara. "How much for a room?" The woman's smile widened. "For you? No charge. Guests are rare in Ravenswood." The trio was shown to a single room at the end of a narrow hallway. The floorboards creaked beneath their feet, and the air grew colder the farther they went. The room itself was small and sparsely furnished, with a single window that overlooked the square. Heavy curtains framed the glass, and when Aaron tried to open them, the rod held firm, as if nailed in place. "This place is giving me the creeps," Mark muttered, dropping his backpack onto one of the twin beds. Clara perched on the edge of the other bed, rubbing her arms. "We'll leave first thing in the morning. Hopefully, someone here can point us to a gas station." Aaron didn't respond. He was standing by the door, his gaze fixed on the hallway beyond. For a moment, He thought he'd seen movement, a shadow gliding past the edge of the doorway. But when he stepped into the hall, it was empty. That night, sleep came reluctantly. The wind outside howled like a living thing, rattling the inn's ancient timbers. In the darkness, Aaron lay awake, his senses on high alert. He could hear Clara's slow, even breathing beside him and Mark's soft snores from the other bed. Yet something felt wrong. A faint noise reached his ears, a whispering low and insistent, like the rustling of dry leaves. He sat up, his pulse quickening, and strained to listen. The sound was coming from the hallway. Carefully, Aaron slipped out of bed and padded to the door. As he opened it, the whispering grew louder, more distinct. The words were unintelligible, but they carried a sinister cadence that made his skin crawl. He stepped into the hall, the old floorboards groaning under his weight. The whispers seemed to be leading him. Down the hall, past the darkened common room, and out into the square. The fog clung to the ground like a living thing, and the frozen clock tower loomed above him. The whispers grew louder still, pulling him toward the base of the tower. And there, in the shadows, he saw it. A figure stood motionless, its back turned to him. It was tall and shrouded in tattered, blackened robes that seemed to shift with the fog. Aaron's breath caught in his throat as the figure slowly turned, revealing a face that was not a face at all, just a void, an endless, hollow darkness. The whispers stopped. The figure began to move toward him. Aaron stumbled back, his legs tangling beneath him. He hit the ground hard, the breath knocked from his lungs. The figure loomed closer, its hollow presence filling the air with an oppressive weight. He tried to scream, but no sound came. And then, just as the void was about to consume him, a hand grabbed his shoulder. Aaron whirled around to see Clara, her face pale with terror. "We need to go," she whispered, her voice trembling. Now, when Aaron turned back, the figure was gone. But the whispers had started again, and this time they were coming from all around. Aaron and Clara bolted back to the inn, Mark trailing close behind after they hastily woke him up. Their hurried footsteps echoed against the cobblestone streets, the oppressive fog clinging to them like a damp shroud. As they reached the creaking inn door, Clara turned back for one final glance at the square. The clock tower loomed silently, its hands still frozen at midnight. The whispers had faded, but the suffocating sense of being watched lingered. Inside the inn, the air felt no safer. The elderly innkeeper was gone, and the dim oil lamp on the counter flickered ominously. Mark glanced around nervously. "What the hell happened out there? Why did you drag me out of bed?" Clara hesitated, her eyes darting to Aaron. "Tell him," she urged. Aaron ran a hand through his hair, struggling to find the words. "There's something out there," he said, his voice low. "I saw felt something. It wasn't human." Mark laughed uneasily, his voice too loud in the stillness. "Okay, you're both losing it. We're in a creepy, rundown village? Sure. But ghosts? Monsters? That's a stretch." "Then explain this," Clara snapped, pulling back the curtain on the small window. The fog outside churned unnaturally, like it was alive. And though the clock tower stood in plain view, its shadow stretched far too long, as though it were reaching for the inn. Mark's smirk faltered. Sleep was impossible. Aaron, Clara, and Mark sat huddled in their room, the feeble glow of a single lamp casting jittery shadows on the walls. They whispered in low tones, trying to make sense of the night's events. "We leave at first light," Aaron insisted. "Even if we have to walk." Clara nodded, though her expression was grim. "But where do we go? There's no sign of a highway, and who knows how far we are from the nearest town." Mark leaned against the wall, his arms crossed. "I say we confront someone. That old woman at the counter seemed to know more than she let on. What if she's hiding something?" Before they could debate further, a sound broke the stillness. A loud, deliberate knock on the door. The three froze, their eyes darting toward the sound. "Who's there?" Clara called out, her voice shaking. No answer. Aaron slowly rose and crept toward the door. His hand trembled as he gripped the doorknob and cracked it open. The hallway was empty. but on the floor lay a single piece of parchment, folded neatly. Aaron bent to pick it up, his heart pounding. The paper was brittle, its edges singed as though it had been burned. Unfolding it, he read the words scrawled in crimson ink. "Do not leave. The village remembers." The cryptic note shattered any hope of rationalizing their situation. Sleep was forgotten as the trio decided they needed answers. Immediately, they ventured out into the dark inn, their flashlight beams cutting through the shadows. "The innkeeper has to be somewhere," Clara whispered, clutching Aaron's arm tightly. "She can't have just disappeared." They searched the common room, the kitchen, and even a small storage closet. But the old woman was nowhere to be found. At last, Mark noticed a narrow door at the end of the hallway. Unlike the others, this door was reinforced with heavy iron bars, and a faint hum seemed to emanate from behind it. "What's back there?" Mark asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Aaron hesitated, then tried the doorknob. It didn't budge. "Locked." Clara stepped forward, her gaze determined. "Move aside." She withdrew a hairpin from her jacket pocket and knelt by the lock. The others watched in silence as she worked, the minutes stretching unbearably. Finally, with a soft click, the door creaked open. The air beyond was colder, carrying a faint metallic tang. A narrow staircase spiraled downward into darkness. "Why would an inn have a basement like this?" Mark muttered, his voice trembling. Aaron's jaw tightened. Only one way to find out. Descending the stairs felt like stepping into another world. The walls were rough stone, damp with condensation. Lanterns hung sporadically along the narrow corridor, their flickering flames casting eerie shadows. The hum grew louder as they descended, resonating in their chests. At the bottom of the stairs, they found themselves in a large circular chamber. The floor was carved with intricate symbols that seemed to pulse faintly with light. In the center of the room stood a stone pedestal, and atop it rested an ancient, leather-bound book. Aaron approached cautiously, his breath visible in the frigid air. "What is this place?" he murmured. Clara's gaze darted over the carvings on the floor. "These symbols, they look like some kind of ritual. This isn't just an inn." Mark hovered near the pedestal, his curiosity overpowering his fear. "This book looks ancient. Maybe it explains what's going on here." Before anyone could stop him, he reached out and opened the book. The pages were filled with strange, spidery writing, interspersed with grotesque illustrations of shadowy figures and misshapen beings. Clara gasped, pointing to one of the pages. "Look at this." Aaron leaned over her shoulder. The illustration showed a village eerily similar to Ravenswood, surrounded by shadowy figures. The accompanying text read, "Bound by the curse of memory, the village stands eternal. To leave is to betray, and betrayal demands a price." "What does it mean by betrayal?" Mark asked, his voice barely audible. Before anyone could respond, the sound of footsteps echoed from the stairs above. The trio froze, their hearts hammering in unison. A figure appeared at the top of the staircase, silhouetted against the flickering lantern light. It was the innkeeper. "You shouldn't be here," she hissed, her voice carrying an edge of panic. "You've meddled where you don't belong." Aaron stepped forward, his fear giving way to anger. "What is this place? What's happening in this village?" The innkeeper's pale eyes glinted in the dim light. "Ravenswood is not a village," she said slowly. "It is a prison for the living and the dead. And now you are part of it." Her words hung heavy in the air, and before anyone could respond, the ground beneath them began to tremble. The carvings on the floor glowed brighter, and the hum turned into a deafening roar. "What's happening?" Clara screamed, clutching Aaron's arm. The innkeeper's expression twisted into something between fear and resignation. "You've awakened them." "Awakened what?" Mark shouted, his voice nearly drowned out by the noise. The answer came not from the innkeeper, but from the shadows themselves. The darkness in the corners of the chamber began to move, coalescing into twisted, humanoid shapes. Their hollow eyes and jagged mouths radiated malice as they stepped forward, their movements unnatural and jerky. Aaron grabbed Clara and Mark, pulling them toward the staircase. "Run," he shouted. But as they turned, the shadows surged forward, cutting off their escape. The trio backed against the wall, their breath coming in short, panicked gasps. The shadowy figures closed in, their hollow eyes glinting with malevolent intent. The room seemed to shrink as the darkness swallowed the light. And then, from the center of the chamber, a voice echoed, a deep, guttural tone that seemed to come from the very walls. "You cannot leave," it growled. "The village remembers." The ground beneath them split open, and Aaron felt himself falling into the void. Aaron's scream echoed as he plunged into the gaping void, his fingers clawing at nothing but air. A cold wind whipped past him, the darkness all-encompassing. Just as the terror reached a crescendo, his descent stopped abruptly, and he landed hard on a stone surface. His breath came in short, ragged gasps as he scrambled to his feet. Above him, Clara and Mark's panicked shouts mingled with the ominous growl of the shadows. "Clara! Mark!" Aaron shouted, his voice hoarse. "Jump! There's a ledge down here." Mark hesitated, glancing at Clara. "Do we trust him? We don't know what's down there." The shadowy figures advanced, their jerky movements closing the distance. Clara's eyes locked with Aaron's, and in that moment, she decided. Grabbing Mark's arm, she pulled him toward the edge. "We don't have a choice," she yelled, leaping into the void with Mark following closely behind. The impact knocked the wind out of them as they landed beside Aaron. Clara groaned, clutching her side, while Mark cursed under his breath. Above them, the gaping hole sealed itself, plunging them into an eerie silence. The trio found themselves in an underground labyrinth, the air thick with the stench of damp earth and decay. The walls were lined with crumbling bricks, etched with the same sinister symbols they had seen in the ritual chamber above. Dim, flickering torches illuminated the corridor ahead, casting long, ominous shadows. Clara coughed, her voice trembling. Where are we?" Aaron shook his head. "I don't know, but we're alive. That's something." Mark examined the walls, running his fingers over the carvings. "This place isn't natural. It's ancient. Older than the village, maybe older than anything we know." A faint noise interrupted him. A soft, distant wailing that seemed to echo from all directions. The sound sent chills racing down their spines. "We need to move," Aaron said, his voice firm. "Staying here isn't an option." Clara nodded, though her legs felt like jelly. The group ventured deeper into the labyrinth, their footsteps echoing unnaturally. As they walked, the wailing grew louder, interspersed with faint whispers. The voices spoke in an unknown language, yet they carried an undeniable sense of anguish. Clara clutched Aaron's arm tightly. "What are they saying?" she whispered. Aaron shook his head. "I don't know, but I don't think they're happy we're here." The corridor opened into a vast chamber, its ceiling disappearing into darkness. In the center stood a massive stone altar, surrounded by dozens of skeletal remains. Each skeleton was posed as if frozen mid-scream, their bony fingers clawing at the ground. Mark swore under his breath. This is a mass grave." Clara knelt beside one of the skeletons, her eyes wide with horror. "Look at this." She pointed to the skull, which bore deep, jagged cracks as though it had been crushed by immense force. Aaron's gaze fell on the altar. It was covered in dried blood, the symbols carved into its surface glowing faintly. In the center lay a single, pristine dagger, its blade etched with runes. "Don't touch it," Clara warned, as Aaron approached the altar. Aaron hesitated, but before he could respond, a voice rang out, clear and sharp. "You shouldn't be here." The trio spun around to see a young woman standing in the shadows, her pale skin glowing faintly in the dim torchlight. She wore tattered clothing, and her eyes were sunken with exhaustion. Yet, there was an unearthly quality about her, a presence that set her apart. "Who are you?" Aaron demanded, stepping protectively in front of Clara. The woman's expression was unreadable. "My name is Lila. I was like you once. A stranger who wandered into Ravenswood." Mark narrowed his eyes. "What do you mean, was? Are you dead?" Lila's lips twisted into a grim smile. Not yet, but I'm bound to this place just like everyone else who enters. The village doesn't let anyone leave. Clara stepped forward, desperation in her voice. How do we escape? There has to be a way. Lila's gaze softened. There is, but it comes with a price. Lila gestured toward the altar. The dagger you see there, it's the key. Ravenswood is bound by an ancient curse, and that blade is both the lock and the release. Aaron frowned. What does that mean? How does it work? Lila hesitated, her eyes flickering to the skeletal remains. The village demands a sacrifice. Blood for freedom. One of you must offer your life, or none of you will escape. The words hung heavy in the air, sinking into their minds like lead weights. Clara's face paled, while Mark shook his head vehemently. This is insane, he said. We're not killing anyone. There has to be another way. Lila's expression turned sorrowful. I thought the same when I first heard the truth. But I've been down here for years, trapped in this nightmare. There is no other way. Aaron looked at the dagger, then at Clara and Mark. His chest tightened as he weighed the impossible decision. What happens if we refuse? Lila's eyes darkened. The shadows will take you. You'll become part of the curse, just like the villagers above. A life of endless torment. Before anyone could respond, the torches flickered violently, and a bone-chilling cold swept through the chamber. The wailing returned, louder and more anguished than before. From the far corners of the room, the shadows began to coalesce, their forms twisting and writhing. They're here, Lila whispered, backing toward the altar. You have to choose. Now! The shadows surged forward, their hollow eyes glowing with malice. Aaron grabbed the dagger, its cold hilt sending a shock through his arm. He turned to Clara and Mark, his voice breaking. Go. Run. Clara's eyes widened in horror. What are you saying? No, we're not leaving you. The shadows closed in, their movements quick and predatory. Aaron raised the dagger, his resolve hardening. I'll distract them. Find another way out. Before he could act, Mark grabbed his arm. Don't be stupid. If someone's going to do this, it should be me. The shadows lunged, their jagged limbs reaching for the group. Lila screamed, her voice lost in the chaos. Aaron made his choice. With a guttural cry, he thrust the dagger into his own palm, letting his blood drip onto the altar. The shadows froze. The room trembled violently as the altar absorbed the blood. The carvings on the walls glowed brighter, and a deafening roar filled the chamber. The shadows retreated, their forms dissipating like smoke. Aaron collapsed to his knees, clutching his bleeding hand. Clara rushed to him, her face streaked with tears. Aaron, what did you do? The voice returned, booming and malevolent. The offering is accepted. The curse remains. The ground beneath them split once more, and the trio was swallowed by the darkness. Aaron's screams echoed as the trio was plunged into darkness once more, the ground beneath them vanishing. The fall seemed endless, the air thick with whispers. Clara felt the sensation of icy hands brushing against her arms, her breath stolen by fear. Then, as suddenly as it began, they landed. The impact jarred her, the cold, stone floor scraping against her palms. A dim, sickly green light flickered around them, revealing a cavern far more sinister than anything they had seen above. The room was enormous, its walls lined with twisted, skeletal figures frozen mid-motion. Their forms were fused into the stone, mouths agape as if screaming in eternal torment. The green light emanated from the center of the cavern, where an ornate pedestal stood, bathed in an otherworldly glow. Upon it rested a massive, black tome bound in leather that seemed to shift and writhe. Mark groaned, clutching his side. Is everyone alive? Clara nodded weakly, glancing around. Aaron, are you okay? Aaron sat up, his injured hand still dripping blood. His face was pale, his breath shallow. I'm fine, just dizzy. Lila's voice interrupted them, her tone sharp and urgent. You shouldn't have done that. She stood nearby, her expression a mix of fear and fury. Aaron glared at her, his voice trembling. You said it needed blood. I gave it. Why are we still here? Lila pointed to the pedestal. The altar demands blood, but the curse's heart is in that book. You've only awakened it. The trio approached the pedestal cautiously, the air growing heavier with each step. Clara's hand instinctively reached out toward the book, but Lila grabbed her wrist. Don't, Lila warned. That's no ordinary book. It's the Book of Shadows, the heart of the curse. It contains the secrets of Ravenswood, and the power to destroy it. Mark frowned. Destroy it? Isn't that what we want? Lila's voice trembled. Yes, but the book doesn't give its knowledge freely. It demands something in return. Something far worse than blood. Aaron stared at the shifting leather cover, unease curling in his stomach. What does it want? Lila hesitated, her gaze fixed on the book. A life, a willing sacrifice. The one who opens it must pay the ultimate price. Clara shook her head violently. This is insane. There has to be another way. Lila's expression hardened. There isn't. The curse feeds on sacrifice. If the book is opened, the village will be free. But the one who breaks the curse will never leave this place. Mark paced back and forth, his fists clenched. So what? We just pick one of us to die. That's not a choice. It's a death sentence. Aaron, still clutching his bleeding hand, stepped forward. If it's the only way, I'll do it. No! Clara's voice broke as she grabbed his arm. You're not doing this. We'll find another way. Aaron met her gaze, his eyes filled with resolve. There is no other way. You heard her. Mark shook his head, his voice rising. Why do you always think you have to play the hero? We're in this together. If anyone should... A deafening roar cut him off. The cavern trembled as the skeletal figures lining the walls began to move. Their jaws snapped open and closed, their hollow eyes glowing with malice. They know we're here, Lila whispered. We don't have much time. The green light dimmed, and from the shadows emerged a towering figure. Its body was a grotesque amalgamation of bones and decaying flesh, its eyes burning with an unnatural fire. It carried a massive scythe, its blade glinting menacingly. Clara's breath hitched. What is that? Lila's voice quavered. The Keeper. It guards the book and ensures the curse remains unbroken. The Keeper raised its scythe, the air vibrating with its unearthly power. Aaron shoved Clara behind him, his voice steady despite his fear. We'll distract it. You figure out how to open the book. Lila hesitated, then nodded. I'll try. Mark grabbed a chunk of broken stone and hurled it at the Keeper. The projectile struck its chest with a dull thud, drawing the creature's attention. It let out an ear-splitting shriek and charged toward them. The group scattered as the Keeper swung its scythe, the blade carving deep gouges into the stone floor. Aaron darted to one side, narrowly avoiding a fatal blow. Mark seized the opportunity to grab another rock, hurling it at the creature's head. Clara clutched Aaron's arm. We can't fight this thing. It's too powerful. Aaron nodded grimly. We're not trying to kill it. Just buy Lila enough time. Lila, meanwhile, approached the pedestal. Her hands trembled as she reached for the book, her mind racing with memories of the warnings she'd ignored. The moment her fingers touched the cover, a jolt of energy surged through her, and the book sprang open. The cavern was flooded with blinding light as the book's pages turned on their own, each one filled with incomprehensible symbols. Lila cried out as the knowledge poured into her mind, overwhelming and searing. The Keeper roared in fury, abandoning its pursuit of Aaron and Mark. It lunged toward Lila, its scythe raised high. Clara screamed, but Aaron reacted instinctively. He grabbed a broken torch from the ground, its embers still faintly glowing, and hurled it at the creature's back. The flames caught, spreading rapidly across the Keeper's decaying flesh. It howled in agony, thrashing wildly as the fire consumed it. Lila seized the opportunity to read aloud from the book, her voice echoing with an unnatural resonance. By the blood spilled, by the souls lost, I call upon the forgotten. Break the chains that bind this place. The cavern shook violently as the book's power surged. The skeletal figures crumbled into dust, and the green light intensified, enveloping the entire chamber. As the light faded, the keeper collapsed into a smoldering heap, its scythe clattering to the ground. The cavern fell silent, save for the sound of Lila's labored breathing. Aaron, Clara, and Mark rushed to her side. The book had closed, its leather cover once again still. But Lila's eyes were wide with terror, her voice barely a whisper. "It's not over. The curse has only begun to shift." The ground beneath them cracked, and a new, even more menacing voice echoed through the chamber. "You cannot break what was never meant to be freed." The floor gave way, and the group plunged into another abyss. The sensation of falling felt eternal, their screams swallowed by the consuming darkness. The icy wind howled around them, tugging at their clothes and seeping into their very bones. When they finally hit solid ground, it wasn't with the bone-crushing force they'd feared, but a suffocating heaviness that pinned them in place. Aaron groaned, blinking against the gloom. The faint glow of the cursed book was still visible in Lila's hands, casting eerie shadows across their surroundings. The air smelled of damp earth and decay, and an unnatural silence pressed down upon them. Clara struggled to her feet, clutching Aaron's arm. "Where are we now?" Her voice was hoarse, her breath trembling. Lila sat up slowly, the book resting heavily in her lap. "We're below the village," she murmured. "Deeper into the curse's heart." Mark scowled, brushing dirt off his jacket. "Great, because the last level of hell wasn't enough." They found themselves in a vast, labyrinthine catacomb. The walls were slick with moisture, and veins of a faint green light pulsed through the stone like a living organism. Skeletal remains lay scattered across the floor, some crumbled to dust, others still eerily intact. Aaron reached down to pick up a rusted lantern, its glass cracked but intact. With a flick of his lighter, the lantern's weak flame added a flicker of warmth to the oppressive darkness. "We need to keep moving," Aaron said, his voice steady despite the terror curling in his chest. "Whatever's waiting for us, standing still isn't going to help." Clara hesitated. "But what if it's worse ahead?" Mark stepped closer, his jaw set. "We don't have a choice. We're already in this nightmare. The only way out is through." Lila glanced at the book, her fingers tracing its edges. "This place feels alive. The curse is watching us." As they moved deeper into the catacombs, the whispers returned, soft at first, then growing louder. The words were incomprehensible, like a language lost to time, but they carried a weight that pressed against their minds. Clara clutched her head. "Do you hear that?" It's in my head." Aaron stopped abruptly, shining the lantern ahead. The path split into two tunnels, each equally foreboding. Carved above the entrances were symbols, faintly glowing in the green light. "What do they mean?" Mark asked, glancing at Lila. Lila furrowed her brow, flipping through the cursed book. The pages moved of their own accord, stopping on an illustration of the symbols. She read aloud, her voice quivering. "One path leads to salvation, the other to eternal torment." Mark threw up his hands. "Great, a 50-50 chance of survival. How do we choose?" The whispers grew louder, almost mocking, as if aware of their indecision. As the group deliberated, a figure emerged from the shadows. A gaunt man, his features hollow and his eyes milky white. He was draped in tattered robes that seemed to meld with the darkness. He raised a skeletal hand, pointing toward the left tunnel. Clara recoiled, clinging to Aaron. "What is that?" The figure didn't speak, but his message was clear. "The left tunnel." Lila narrowed her eyes, clutching the book. "He's a guide, a remnant of the curse." Mark scoffed. "And we're supposed to trust him? He looks like he's part of this nightmare." The figure stood unmoving, his bony hand still pointing. The whispers seemed to soften, as if urging them to follow. Aaron took a deep breath. "We don't have time to argue. We take the left tunnel." Mark hesitated, then nodded reluctantly. "Fine. But if this gets us killed, I'm haunting you." The left tunnel was narrower, the air colder. The lantern's light barely pierced the oppressive darkness, and the walls seemed to pulse, as if the catacombs themselves were alive. The group walked in tense silence, their footsteps echoing. The whispers faded, replaced by an even more unnerving sound, soft, shuffling movements just beyond the lantern's glow. Clara gripped Aaron's arm. "There's something behind us." Aaron spun around, raising the lantern. The light caught fleeting glimpses of shadowy figures, their forms shifting and insubstantial. They seemed to slither along the walls, their hollow eyes fixed on the group. "Keep moving," Aaron urged, his voice tight. "Don't look back." The shadows grew bolder, darting closer with each step. Mark picked up a loose bone from the ground, wielding it like a club. "If these things get any closer..." "I'm swinging." Lila's voice trembled. "You can't fight them. They're part of the curse." The tunnel opened into a vast chamber, dominated by a circular stone altar in the center. Chains hung from the ceiling, and ancient runes were carved into the floor, glowing faintly. The skeletal guide appeared again, this time standing beside the altar. He gestured toward it, his meaning clear. Lila approached the altar cautiously, the book in her hands. "This is the heart of the curse," she whispered. "The place where it all began." Aaron joined her, his jaw tight. "What do we do?" The book's pages flipped again, stopping on a blood-red illustration of the altar. Lila read aloud, her voice echoing in the chamber. "To break the curse, a soul must willingly offer itself. A sacrifice to seal the darkness." Clara shook her head violently. "No, we're not doing this. There has to be another way." Mark's face darkened. "We've heard that before. It didn't end well." The whispers returned, louder and more insistent, as if the chamber itself demanded their compliance. The skeletal guide stepped closer, his hollow eyes fixed on Aaron. Lila's breath hitched. "It's choosing him." Aaron froze, the weight of the guide's gaze heavy on his soul. "Me? Why?" Lila's voice was barely a whisper. "The curse doesn't just demand a life. It chooses someone who's connected to the darkness." Aaron's stomach churned. Memories of his childhood flooded back. Nights spent staring at shadows that seemed to move, dreams of voices calling his name. He had always dismissed them as imagination. But now, Clara stepped between Aaron and the altar. "No, I won't let this happen." The chamber trembled, the runes glowing brighter. The skeletal guide raised his hand, pointing at Aaron again. The shadows in the room surged forward, encircling the group. Their forms solidified, revealing twisted, human-like figures with gaping maws and clawed hands. The guide stepped onto the altar, merging with the shadows, his voice finally speaking, a guttural, ancient tone. "The sacrifice must be made, or the darkness will consume you all." Aaron clenched his fists, his voice steady. "If it's the only way to end this, then I'll..." Before he could finish, the shadows lunged, dragging Clara toward the altar. Her screams filled the chamber as the runes flared to life. "No!" Aaron shouted, racing after her. The chamber erupted into chaos, the fate of the group hanging by a thread. The chamber's cacophony of screams, whispers, and the eerie hum of ancient runes surged to a fever pitch. Aaron lunged toward Clara, his arms outstretched, but the shadows encasing her seemed alive, dragging her closer to the altar. Her terrified eyes locked onto his, silently begging for help. The skeletal guide, now fused with the swirling darkness, loomed over the altar, his form a grotesque blend of bone and shadow. His guttural voice echoed in the chamber. "One must give so the rest may live." Aaron's heart pounded as he grappled with the shadows, their icy tendrils sapping his strength. "Let her go," he roared, his voice cracking with desperation. Lila clutched the cursed book tightly, her mind racing. "There has to be another way," she murmured, flipping through its pages. But the book's glow dimmed, its knowledge slipping away like sand through her fingers. Mark gritted his teeth, grabbing a loose chain from the wall. He swung it with all his might at the shadows, but it passed through them like smoke. "This isn't working," he shouted. "We're losing her." The whispers grew louder, each one seemingly directed at Aaron. They weren't just noises, they were voices from his past, His mother's soft lullaby, his father's stern warnings, his own childhood cries in the dead of night. The curse was reaching into his soul, pulling at his buried fears. "Stop!" Aaron screamed, tears streaming down his face. "Take me instead." The shadows froze. The skeletal guide turned his hollow gaze toward Aaron, tilting his head as if considering the offer. The runes on the altar flared, casting the chamber in a blood-red light. "No!" Clara cried, struggling against the shadows. "Aaron, don't do this." Aaron stepped closer to the altar, his voice steady despite the terror in his eyes. "If this is what it takes to end this nightmare, I'll do it." The shadows released Clara, throwing her to the ground. She scrambled to her feet, her sobs echoing in the chamber. "You can't." "I have to," Aaron interrupted, his gaze unwavering. "This ends with me." The skeletal guide raised his bony hand, gesturing for Aaron to step onto the altar. The whispers softened, replaced by an oppressive silence. Even the shadows seemed to retreat, forming a ring around the altar like silent spectators. Aaron climbed onto the cold stone, his breath fogging in the frigid air. The guide placed a clawed hand on his chest, and a searing pain shot through him. He gritted his teeth, refusing to cry out. Lila approached cautiously, the book still in her hands. "There's something wrong," she said, her voice trembling. "The book doesn't say this will end the curse. It just says it will bind it to whoever sacrifices themselves." Mark frowned. "Bind it? What does that mean?" Lila's eyes widened as the realization hit her. "It means Aaron won't die. He'll become part of the curse." Aaron looked at Lila, his face pale but resolute. "If it keeps all of you safe, then I'll do it." Clara grabbed his arm, her voice breaking. "You don't have to do this. We'll find another way." Aaron gently pulled his arm free. "Clara, I need you to live. All of you. Someone has to make it out of here." The skeletal guide began to chant in that guttural, ancient language. The runes on the altar pulsed with each word, their glow intensifying. Aaron felt the darkness creeping into his mind, filling every corner with an overwhelming weight. But just as the final words of the chant echoed through the chamber, Lila stepped forward, her voice firm. "Wait!" The guide paused, his milky eyes narrowing. The shadows hissed, but they did not move. Lila held up the book, pointing to a passage. "The curse was created by a betrayal. If we can break the bond of that betrayal, we can destroy the curse entirely. No one has to become part of it." Aaron's heart leapt with a faint glimmer of hope. "How do we do that?" Lila hesitated. "We have to find the source of the curse, the betrayal that started it all. If we can undo it." Mark groaned. "You mean we have to go deeper into this hellhole?" The guide hissed, his form beginning to dissolve into the shadows. "You seek what cannot be undone. The curse will claim you all." The shadows surged forward again, their movements frenzied. Aaron jumped down from the altar, grabbing Clara and pulling her toward the nearest tunnel. "Move! Now!" The group sprinted into the darkness, the lantern's flickering light their only guide. The whispers returned, louder and more insistent, mingling with the sound of the shadows pursuing them. After what felt like an eternity, they stumbled into another chamber, smaller and less imposing than the first. In the center stood a pedestal, and on it rested an ornate dagger, its blade inscribed with the same runes that adorned the altar. Lila approached cautiously, the book glowing faintly in her hands. This is the key." Aaron frowned. "To what?" Lila traced her fingers over the runes. The betrayal wasn't just an act. It was a ritual. Someone sacrificed a loved one to gain power, and the curse was born from their hatred and regret. If we use this dagger to reverse the ritual, we can end it. Mark crossed his arms. And let me guess, reversing it isn't as simple as saying some magic words. Lila nodded. We'll need to find the remains of the one who was betrayed. Only then can we break the bond. As the group absorbed this revelation, the shadows began to seep into the chamber, their forms writhing with rage. The skeletal guide's voice echoed from the darkness. You cannot escape. The curse will consume you, Aaron grabbed the dagger, its weight surprisingly light in his hand. "We're not giving up." The group fled once more, following the faint glimmers of green light that seemed to guide them. The shadows closed in, their claws swiping just inches from their backs. Finally, they emerged into a cavern filled with ancient graves. The air was heavy with the scent of decay, and the ground was littered with bones. In the center of the cavern stood a single, undisturbed grave, its headstone marked with the same runes as the dagger. "This is it," Lila said, her voice barely above a whisper. Aaron knelt beside the grave, the dagger trembling in his hand. "What now?" Lila flipped through the book, her voice urgent. "You have to drive the dagger into the earth and speak the words of reversal." The shadows swirled around them, their screeches deafening. The guide's form emerged once more, his voice booming. "If you break the bond, the curse will take you all." Aaron ignored him, plunging the dagger into the ground. The runes on the blade flared to life, and he shouted the incantation Lila read aloud. The ground beneath them shook violently, and a blinding light erupted from the grave. The shadows screamed, their forms disintegrating, but the light began to pull at the group as well. Aaron's voice rang out over the chaos. "Hold on!" But as the light intensified, the ground gave way, and they were swallowed by the abyss once more. The descent into the abyss felt eternal, a chaotic blur of light, darkness, and the deafening roar of wind. Aaron grasped Clara's hand tightly, feeling her fingers trembling against his own. Lila clutched the cursed book to her chest, her lips moving in silent prayers. Mark screamed curses into the void, his voice swallowed by the maelstrom. When the fall ended, it wasn't a crash but a sudden, jarring stillness. Aaron opened his eyes to find himself lying on soft earth, the scent of damp moss filling the air. A pale, sickly light illuminated the area, its source a glowing tree in the distance. Around them stretched a vast forest, its twisted trees clawing at the oppressive sky. Where are we?" Clara whispered, her voice breaking the silence. Lila struggled to her feet, her eyes wide with both fear and awe. "I think we're inside the curse. This isn't the real world. It's where the betrayal lives." Mark spat on the ground, his usual bravado replaced with unease. "Great. We're in the belly of the beast. Now what?" Aaron's gaze fixed on the glowing tree. Its light pulsed like a heartbeat, sending waves of energy through the forest. "That tree. It has to mean something." The book in Lila's hands shimmered faintly. She opened it, flipping through its pages until she stopped at an illustration of a similar tree. "This is the source, the betrayal's heart. If we destroy it, the curse will end." Clara frowned, her voice trembling. "Destroy it? How?" "It's a tree, not a monster." Lila pointed to the dagger Aaron still held. Its runes glowed faintly, resonating with the tree's light. "The dagger isn't just a weapon. It's the key. But the closer we get to the source, the stronger the curse will fight back." As the group began their cautious journey toward the tree, the forest came alive. Shadows slithered between the trees, their whispers growing louder and more venomous. Aaron tightened his grip on the dagger, its weight somehow comforting. He glanced back at Clara, who was clutching his arm, her eyes darting around the forest. "Stay close," he said softly. Lila led the way, the book in her hands glowing brighter with each step. Mark brought up the rear, his eyes scanning the treeline for movement. They didn't have to wait long. A low growl echoed through the forest, followed by the rustling of leaves. Dark shapes emerged from the shadows, twisted, humanoid figures with hollow eyes and skeletal frames. Their movements were jerky, unnatural, as if they were puppets on invisible strings. "What the hell are those?" Mark shouted, raising a branch he'd picked up as a weapon. Lila's face paled. "They're the betrayed, the villagers who were sacrificed to create the curse. They're trapped here, bound to the curse." Aaron stepped forward, the dagger's runes flaring as if in recognition. "They're coming for us." The first figure lunged, its claws swiping at Aaron's face. He ducked, thrusting the dagger upward. The blade pierced the creature's chest, and it dissolved into black smoke with a guttural wail. Clara screamed as another creature lunged at her, its bony fingers grasping for her throat. Mark swung his branch with all his strength, knocking the creature to the ground. Lila recited words from the book, and a burst of light erupted from its pages, forcing the creatures back momentarily. "They're endless," Mark shouted, panting. Aaron wiped sweat from his brow, his heart pounding. "We have to keep moving. They'll overwhelm us if we stay here." The group pushed forward, hacking, dodging, and weaving through the onslaught of creatures. The glowing tree grew closer, its light pulsing faster, as if it were aware of their approach. When they finally broke through the forest's edge, they found themselves in a clearing. The glowing tree stood at its center, its massive roots spreading like veins across the ground. But they weren't alone. Standing before the tree was a figure, tall and imposing, shrouded in a cloak of shadows. Its face was obscured, but its eyes burned like embers. In its hand, it held a staff made of blackened wood, the runes etched into it glowing with malevolent energy. "The Guardian," Lila whispered, her voice barely audible. The figure raised its staff and the earth trembled. Shadows erupted from the ground, forming jagged spikes that shot toward the group. Aaron dove to the side, pulling Clara with him. The Guardian's voice was a deep, guttural growl. "You seek to undo what cannot be undone. Leave or be consumed." Aaron stepped forward, holding the dagger aloft. Its runes flared brightly, pushing back the encroaching shadows. "We're not leaving. This ends here." The Guardian's laugh was cold and hollow. "You are but mortals, playing with forces beyond your comprehension." Lila flipped through the book frantically. The Guardian is a manifestation of the curse's creator. It's the physical embodiment of their hatred and regret. If we defeat it, the source will be vulnerable. Mark scoffed. "And how exactly are we supposed to defeat that thing?" Aaron glanced at the dagger, then at the tree. "We distract it long enough for me to get to the tree. If I can destroy the source, you'll have to get through me first," the Guardian growled, slamming its staff into the ground. A wave of darkness surged toward the group. "Go!" Lila shouted, raising the book. She recited an incantation, and a barrier of light formed around them, slowing the wave's advance. Aaron sprinted toward the tree, the dagger glowing brighter with each step. Clara and Mark followed, doing their best to fend off the shadows that lunged at them. The Guardian roared, its staff crackling with dark energy. It hurled bolts of shadow at Aaron, each one narrowly missing as he zigzagged toward the tree. Just as Aaron reached the tree, the Guardian appeared before him, its form materializing out of the shadows. It swung its staff, and Aaron barely managed to block the blow with the dagger. The impact sent him sprawling to the ground, the dagger skidding out of reach. The Guardian loomed over him, raising its staff for a final strike. "Aaron!" Clara screamed, running toward him. The tree's light dimmed, its pulse slowing, as if sensing its champion's impending defeat. But then, a faint voice echoed in Aaron's mind, soft, gentle, and filled with sorrow. "You have the strength. End this." Aaron's hand shot out, grabbing the dagger. He rolled to his feet, his eyes blazing with determination. The Guardian hesitated, as if it, too, heard the voice. With a primal shout, Aaron lunged forward, the dagger aimed at the Guardian's heart. The dagger plunged forward, its runes blazing like molten fire. The Guardian's staff intercepted it mid-swing, but the force of Aaron's strike sent sparks flying into the air. The creature snarled, its ember-like eyes flaring with rage as Aaron pressed forward. Behind him, Clara and Mark fended off a new wave of the shadow creatures, while Lila frantically flipped through the book, her voice trembling as she chanted protective incantations. The dagger's glow intensified, and Aaron felt a surge of warmth coursing through him. The voice that had called out to him moments before returned, softer but more insistent. "You're so close. The Guardian is but a shadow. Strike true, and the tree will fall." The Guardian roared, its form flickering as if struggling to maintain its shape. "You dare challenge the curse itself? You will fail, as all before you have failed." Aaron gritted his teeth. We're not like the others. With a final push, he drove the dagger downward, aiming directly at the guardian's chest. The blade sank into the shadowy form, and for a moment the world seemed to stop. The guardian let out a blood-curdling scream, its body convulsing as light erupted from the wound. Shadows poured from its form like liquid smoke, writhing and dissipating into the air. But as the guardian fell to its knees, Aaron realized the battle wasn't over. The tree pulsed violently, its light flickering erratically. Roots erupted from the ground, lashing out like serpents. One struck Aaron, sending him sprawling, the dagger slipping from his grasp once more. "Aaron!" Clara cried, dodging a lashing root and sprinting to his side. Mark shouted as he swung his makeshift weapon at the roots. "This is insane. That thing's alive." "It's not alive," Lila called out, her voice steady despite the chaos. "It's the curse reacting to the guardian's fall. The tree is the true heart of the curse. It's trying to protect itself." Aaron struggled to his feet, clutching his ribs. "Then we have to end it. The dagger." "I've got it," Clara yelled, diving for the blade. Just as her fingers closed around it, a massive root wrapped around her waist, lifting her into the air. "Clara!" Aaron shouted, his heart pounding as he watched her struggle against the root's grip. "Finish it!" she screamed, holding out the dagger. Aaron snatched the dagger from Clara's hand just as the root tightened its grip, eliciting a cry of pain from her. Lila's voice cut through the din, her tone urgent. "Aaron, you have to sever the tree's connection to the curse. The book says the heart is buried beneath its roots. Stab the ground at its base." Mark swung his branch, managing to free Clara just as another root lashed toward him. The two scrambled back, their movements frantic. Aaron didn't hesitate. He sprinted toward the glowing tree, dodging the thrashing roots and the few remaining shadow creatures that lunged at him. The tree's pulse quickened, its light growing almost blinding. Aaron dropped to his knees at its base, the ground beneath him vibrating with an ominous hum. "Do it, Aaron!" Lila shouted, her voice barely audible over the cacophony. He raised the dagger high and plunged it into the earth. A deafening crack split the air as the dagger pierced the ground. The vibrations intensified, and the tree's light flared, casting harsh shadows across the forest. Aaron held on as the earth beneath him began to split, fiery light spilling from the cracks. The roots recoiled, writhing as if in pain. The shadow creatures let out unearthly wails before dissolving into smoke. The glowing tree let out one final mournful pulse before its light dimmed. Its massive trunk began to splinter, and with a groaning creak, it toppled over, crashing to the ground in a shower of sparks. The forest fell silent. Aaron stood shakily, his legs weak from the effort. Clara and Mark ran to his side, their faces pale but relieved. "You did it," Clara said, her voice barely above a whisper. Lila approached, clutching the book tightly. Her expression was grim. "It's not over yet." Aaron frowned. "What do you mean?" "The tree's gone. The curse is broken." Lila shook her head. "The curse was anchored to the tree, but destroying it means the curse has to go somewhere. It won't just disappear. It needs a vessel." Before anyone could react, the dagger in Aaron's hand began to glow again. Its runes pulsed violently, and a sharp, searing pain shot through his arm. "Aaron!" Clara screamed as he dropped to his knees, clutching his arm. The voice returned, no longer soft but filled with urgency. "You must choose. Contain the curse, or let it spread anew." Aaron's vision blurred as memories of the villagers flashed before his eyes. Their pain, their betrayal, their eternal suffering. "I'll contain it," he whispered, his voice strained. The dagger's light consumed Aaron, enveloping him in a blinding glow. Clara and Mark tried to reach him, but an invisible force pushed them back. "No, Aaron, don't!" Clara shouted, tears streaming down her face. Lila grabbed her arm, her own eyes filled with sorrow. "It's the only way." Aaron's body arched as the curse poured into him, the light from the dagger seeping into his skin. The forest around them began to shift, the twisted trees straightening, their leaves returning. The oppressive darkness lifted, revealing a clear, starry sky. When the light finally faded, Aaron lay motionless on the ground. Clara dropped to her knees beside him, shaking his shoulders. "Aaron, wake up." He opened his eyes slowly, a faint smile on his lips. "It's over." But his eyes were different. No longer their usual warm brown, but streaked with faint, glowing runes. Lila stepped forward, her voice hesitant. "Aaron, you've become the vessel." He stood, his movements slow but deliberate. "The curse is contained for now. But if I lose control—" Mark looked at him, his usual bravado replaced with unease. "What do we do?" Aaron's gaze turned to the horizon, where the faint outline of another village could be seen. "We keep moving. The curse isn't just in this village. It's everywhere, and we have to stop it." As the group set off, the forest behind them faded into silence, its secrets buried once more. But the faint whispers lingered, carried on the wind, a haunting reminder that the curse was far from defeated. The road ahead seemed endless, the dense trees surrounding them like watchful sentinels. The village behind them was a haunting memory now, its once vibrant streets silenced by the curse Aaron had contained. But as the group trekked forward, a growing unease settled in their hearts. Aaron's transformation had not gone unnoticed. His eyes, now glowing faintly with the curse's power, cast a dim light whenever he looked toward the others. His presence felt heavier, as though the very air around him was charged with an oppressive energy. Clara tried to ignore it, keeping her focus on the road ahead. They had to keep moving. There was no turning back now. But as the hours stretched on, the weight of the journey began to wear on them. Tired, hungry, and still haunted by what had happened in the village, they had no choice but to press forward. Lila walked beside Aaron, her brow furrowed with worry. She had never seen someone so deeply bound to the curse. The book had told them that the curse was a malevolent force that could consume its host if not properly contained. And though Aaron seemed in control, she couldn't shake the feeling that they were on borrowed time. Mark, who had been quiet for most of the journey, finally spoke up. "Do you think this is really over? That we've stopped it?" He looked at Aaron, his eyes full of doubt. Aaron's gaze remained fixed ahead. His voice was low, heavy with the burden of his choice. "It's over for now, but the curse was never confined to that tree. It lives in the land, in the air, in every shadow. And if I lose control—" He trailed off, the weight of the words hanging in the air between them. Clara bit her lip, trying to shake the feeling that their fight was far from over. The village they had left behind wasn't the only one touched by the curse. There would be more. They had to find a way to stop it before it spread too far. Nightfall came, and with it, a chilling silence. The air had grown colder, and the shadows seemed to stretch unnaturally long as they made camp. The stars above were obscured by thick clouds, adding to the heavy atmosphere that pressed down on them. Lila had built a small fire, the flames crackling softly in the stillness. Clara sat on a nearby log, her thoughts swirling. What had really happened in that village? And how could they stop the curse from spreading? Aaron's transformation had only confirmed what they feared, that the curse wasn't just some ancient evil, but something far more powerful, something that had been awakened. Aaron stood on the outskirts of the camp, his figure bathed in the faint glow of the firelight. His hands clenched into fists, the runes on his skin pulsing ever so slightly. He was fighting it, but for how long? A rustle in the trees caused Clara to snap to attention, her heart racing. Mark stood beside her, his expression tense as he scanned the darkness. "I don't like this," he muttered. The silence grew deeper, more oppressive. The wind picked up, rustling the leaves in a way that didn't feel natural. And then, just when Clara thought she'd imagined it, she heard it, the faintest whisper, barely audible above the wind. "You are not free." It was a voice, low and guttural, carrying with it an unmistakable sense of malice. Clara's blood ran cold. It was as if the forest itself was speaking, its voice laced with the curse's power. Mark grabbed her arm. "Did you hear that?" Clara nodded, her voice barely a whisper. It's the curse. It's not gone. It's still here. Lila stood up, her face pale. We need to move. Now. Aaron turned toward them, his eyes glowing with an unsettling intensity. It's already too late. Before anyone could react, the ground beneath them began to tremble. The earth split, sending cracks snaking through the forest floor. A deep, resonant growl reverberated through the air, and the trees around them began to bend unnaturally, their trunks warping as if being pulled by some unseen force. A low, otherworldly chant echoed through the night, growing louder with each passing moment. The runes on Aaron's body flared brightly, and he staggered back, clutching his head as if in pain. No, he gasped. I'm losing control. Clara rushed to him, but a wave of dark energy burst forth from him, knocking her to the ground. She cried out in pain as the force of the blast sent her sprawling across the dirt. Lila and Mark were both thrown to the ground as well, the air thick with malevolent energy. The trees around them continued to twist and groan, their branches reaching like skeletal hands. From the depths of the forest, a figure emerged, a shadow that seemed to stretch and move with unnatural speed. Its shape was indistinct, shifting between the trees like smoke, but its presence was unmistakable. The curse had found its new host. Aaron's voice broke through the chaos, filled with desperation. I can't stop it. It's too strong. Lila reached for the book, but before she could open it, the figure was upon them, its presence consuming everything. It moved with a fluid grace, a darkness that swallowed the light. The voice, the same voice they had heard earlier, echoed in their minds. You thought you could contain me? I am eternal. The figure reached out, and the world around them seemed to warp. The shadows grew deeper, the forest itself bending and stretching as though reality itself was being rewritten. Aaron fell to his knees, his breath ragged. I'm sorry. I didn't know it would be like this. Clara, shaken but determined, crawled toward him, her heart racing. We're not done yet, Aaron. We're not giving up. But the forest, the cursed land, was beginning to close in on them. They were trapped. In the distance, the faint outline of another village appeared, more desolate than the last. As the curse began to take hold, the whispers grew louder. The shadows surged, and the figure loomed closer. Aaron stood, his eyes wild. I have to finish this. It's the only way. Clara's heart skipped a beat. What do you mean? Aaron. But before she could finish, the figure's darkness swallowed him whole. And then, there was only silence. Clara stood frozen in place, her heart pounding in her chest as Aaron disappeared into the suffocating darkness. The ground beneath her trembled violently, and the ominous whispers echoed louder, sending chills racing up her spine. No! She cried, scrambling to her feet, her body trembling as she rushed toward the spot where Aaron had vanished. Aaron! But no matter how much she screamed, no matter how fast she ran, the darkness seemed to stretch farther, swallowing everything in its path. She reached the edge of the forest, the shadows thick and oppressive, but Aaron was nowhere to be found. Mark and Lila appeared behind her, their faces pale with fear and exhaustion. Clara, we need to get out of here, Mark shouted, his voice tinged with panic. This place, it's not just cursed, it's alive. The curse is the land itself. Clara turned to them, her eyes wild with terror. I can't leave him. We have to find Aaron. We have to stop this. Lila's voice was quieter, but no less desperate. Clara, you saw what happened to him. The curse is taking over. We can't let it spread any farther. For a moment, Clara faltered, her mind racing with the impossible choice she had to make. But then, a dark realization hit her. If they didn't stop the curse now, it would continue to spread, infecting the world beyond the forest. They had to end it here. But how? The air around them seemed to warp as they stood at the edge of the cursed forest. The whispers had intensified, swirling around them like an invisible storm. Clara clenched her fists, determination flooding her veins. There had to be a way. The ancient book that had led them this far still burned in Lila's hands. She opened it once again, scanning the pages frantically, searching for the final piece of the puzzle. "There's one last thing," Lila said, her voice shaking. "A final ritual. If we can summon the power of the curse, we can trap it. But it requires a sacrifice." Clara looked at Lila, her heart sinking. "A sacrifice? What do you mean?" Lila hesitated, the weight of the decision clearly heavy on her shoulders. "One of us must offer their life force to bind the curse forever." Clara's breath caught in her throat. "No, we can't." Mark stepped forward, his jaw clenched. "There's no time. If we don't stop it now, the curse will consume everything." Clara turned to face him, her eyes filled with pain. "But we can't just give up a life. This isn't what we came here to do." Lila's eyes were full of sorrow. "Sometimes, to end a curse, there has to be a sacrifice. One life for the future of many." Clara looked toward the darkening horizon, the village beyond barely visible through the storm of shadows. The cursed figure had not yet appeared again, but she could feel its presence lurking, waiting to pounce. They didn't have much time. The curse was growing stronger, feeding on their fear. "I'll do it," Mark said suddenly, his voice steady. Clara turned sharply to him, her heart breaking. "Mark, no, you can't." "I know what's at stake," Mark interrupted, his eyes meeting hers with a resolve that left no room for argument. "If it means saving everyone else, I'll do it. I can't let this curse spread any further. We came here to stop it, and I'm going to make sure we do." Tears welled in Clara's eyes, but she knew deep down that Mark was right. There was no other way. They had fought through so much already. If they didn't act now, the entire world would fall prey to the curse. Lila, her face filled with sorrow, placed the book in Mark's hands. "We'll help you," she whispered. "We won't let you do it alone." Mark nodded, taking a deep breath as he stepped into the heart of the cursed forest. The ground beneath his feet seemed to pulse with a malevolent energy, but he held his ground. Clara and Lila followed him closely, their eyes fixed on him with a mixture of fear and admiration. In the center of the forest, beneath the twisted trees and the ever-present shadows, Mark raised his hands to the sky. The whispers intensified, a low, guttural chant rising from the earth itself. It was as though the forest itself was alive, feeding off his energy. The ritual began. The pages of the ancient book fluttered violently, the words glowing with an eerie, otherworldly light. Clara and Lila stood by Mark's side, their hands trembling as they joined the chant, their voices rising in a desperate harmony. The air crackled with energy, a bright flash of light bursting from the center of the forest. The cursed figure appeared again, its form even more terrifying than before. Its face was a mask of rage, its eyes burning with an unnatural fire. Mark's voice rang out, cutting through the chaos. "This ends now." The light intensified, and the figure screeched in fury, its form writhing in the air like a twisted shadow. But it couldn't escape the power of the ritual. The curse was being pulled back, bound once more by the force of Mark's sacrifice. As the light flared one final time, Clara closed her eyes, tears streaming down her face. The forest was silent. The whispers were gone. The curse had been broken. But at what cost? The silence that followed the ritual was deafening. Clara slowly opened her eyes, her heart heavy with the weight of what they had just done. The forest, once thick with shadows, was now still and quiet. The dark energy had dissipated, and the oppressive feeling that had hung over them for so long was gone. Mark was gone. In his place stood a faint, glowing figure, a reflection of the power he had just released. He had given himself to end the curse, to protect the world from the horror that had nearly consumed them. Clara fell to her knees, her heart breaking. "Mark, no." Lila put a hand on her shoulder, her own grief evident in her eyes. He knew what he was doing. He knew it was the only way. Clara nodded, her throat tight with emotion. "We'll make sure his sacrifice wasn't in vain." As the first light of dawn broke through the trees, Clara and Lila stood together, the weight of their journey heavy on their hearts. The curse had been broken. The forgotten village, the terror, and the horrors of the land were finally at an end. But even in the quiet aftermath, Clara knew that darkness was never truly gone, could return again. But for now, at least they were free. And with that final thought, the two of them walked away from the forest, leaving behind the shadows of the forgotten village.